So why does some metal sound like this and some like this? How do we get from Elvis to Nurgle? The real question, what's the story of metal? Let's start simple with the 60s. The 60s rock renaissance bands began to create heavier and moodier songs, Rolling Stones with Paint It Black and the Beatles with Helter Skelter. These songs were influential, but we can trace metal back further than that. A lot of people agree that one progenitor of the sound to be James Cotton in the song Cotton Crop Blues, where you can hear a lot of those early metal sounds in it. These sounds progressed and evolved through these previously mentioned artists and throughout the 60s with other bands like Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix. But they all coalesced into a single point, Birmingham, England. Tony Iommi was working his last shift at the factory, ready to tour with his band Mythology. Unfortunately, there was an accident that resulted in Iommi losing the tips of two of his fingers on his right hand, his playing hand, nearly forcing him to give up the guitar. This, of course, like any good story, wasn't the end for Tony. He made two plastic and leather caps for his fingers to keep on playing, and his old band happened to break up. These were the initial steps for the first metal band. Him and the drummer Bill Ward sought out members to start anew, adding Geezer Butler and Ozzy Osbourne to the band that would be known worldwide as Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath is iconic and coined as the grandfathers of metal, introducing music to the public that just simply hadn't been heard before. Both sound and societal commentary that just weren't eclectic to the contemporary flower power era music. By the 1980s, bands like Iron Maiden were firmly reaching into the British top 10, placing themselves within the cultural mainstream and as a dominant force in the music industry. As the decade rolled on, the music began to reach into America. Los Angeles found itself as the breeding ground for a new genre that would propel itself into the cultural limelight, with a few derivations from its British counterpart. Something that would be the most derisive genre in the community until nu metal with Limp Bizkit showed up. It firmly split the genre of metals between mainstream and underground. Hair metal. Motley Crue, Alice Cooper, Poison, the list goes on, all hailing from sunny California. The subgenre began to shift away from its dark and brooding roots into something that sold a different experience, the spectacle. Frizzy hair, lyrics, the rock and roll lifestyle, tight leather, and eyeliner. Being the first form of metal to get an album on #1 on Billboard 200, hair metal was so prolific in fact that in '85, artists from bands like Twisted Sister were giving testimony in Senate against the PMRC trying to censor the genre. Despite the PMRC's attempt to subvert the harmful rock and roll plague infecting the youth of America, it only emboldened the bands and made them more controversial, making them sell more records. Hair metal was topping the charts all over the country. It had become metal's most profitable incarnation. From Bon Jovi to Kiss, it was at the top. Surprisingly, though, in Los Angeles, there was something completely different brewing in the genre. A yang to hair metal's yin. Thrash metal. Influenced in the early 80s by hardcore and Britain's newer heavy metal scene, bands began to form that defined the new genre and underground scene like the Big Four. Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, Anthrax all emerged, faster and louder than anything heard before. Thrash turned all notions of what metal could be up a notch. For example, Slayer had been up and coming in the scene. After borrowing money from the frontman's dad and another band member, they recorded their first album, Show No Mercy, getting them enough notoriety to be signed to Def Jam Records, a hip-hop label oddly enough. Censorship came again from Glander Thrash though. Columbia Records, distributed to Def Jam, refused to release the newest album, Rain and Blood, due to their single, Angel of Death, which regaled the horrors of Auschwitz and Joseph Mengele. The entire album received almost no radio play and wasn't listed on the final distributor's release list, Geffen Records. It went on to hit 94 on the Billboard 200 and to be certified gold in the US. Seems like companies don't learn. This precedent of heavier and heavier metal continued on as bands began to exploring a part of the genre known as extreme metal, taking the shock factor up to 11. Death metal bands began forming in the mid-80s, with the first bands being San Francisco's Possessed in '83 and Florida's Death in '84, producing blast-beated, guttural, vocaled underground hits, with its rise being attributed to Slayer by MTV. Death metal was never able to reach the cultural mainstream, but there were popular bands like Cannibal Corpse, who even got featured in an Ace Ventura movie, and Behemoth, whose singer was taken to court by the Polish government for its blasphemy laws. Meanwhile, in the EU, Norwegian dudes in corpse paint were burning down churches, selling bits of their friend's skull who committed suicide, stabbing each other 23 times to death. Good old mayhem. They were producing another genre of extreme metal known as black metal. focused on more avant-garde, lo-fi instrumentation with paganistic and satanic subject matters. Here are some nice soothing examples of that. You could make hours of film on just the band Mayhem, and people already have. Check out the documentary Until the Light Dies or Lords of Chaos by Netflix, surprisingly enough. Extreme gore warning on the documentary Until the Light Takes Us. It'll show you where they got the bits of the skull. Into the 90s, hair metal had already begun to fade, and thrash was losing its place to grunge metal with bands like Nirvana and Dead Kennedys. There are other bands like Pantera carving out new genres like groove metal, but grunge was at the top and thrash had begun to fade back into obscurity. Thrash giants like Metallica and Megadeth had begun to change their sound to conform more to the mainstream, while Iron Maiden and Judas Priest frontmen both left, leaving the bands on a hiatus. Thrash had just gone into purgatory. This wasn't the end for metal, though, eventually carving itself back in the mainstream with a new genre, nu metal. The late 90s produced a fusion of hip-hop, rap, hardcore, and heavy metal that many love and even more hate. Dave Mustaine from Megadeth even said that he'd rather have his eyelids ripped out than listen to the new genre. Eyelids Are Not Nu Metal exploded into cultural relevancy, with the apotheosis of the genre being in forms like Slipknot's Iowa, Korn's Follow the Leader, System of a Down's Toxicity, and Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory, all peaking to number 1 on Billboard 200. These bands define the musical taste of a lot of the generation's kids, and even those who wouldn't consider themselves metalheads would be able to recognize a lot of the songs from the era. After dominating the metal genre from the late 90s to early 2000s, nu metal's extreme limelight began to give way to boring derivatives and uninspired cash grabs, eventually leading to its over-bloated death, fading away almost entirely. This death gave way to new genres, however, and from the 2000s onward, metal continued to enjoy popularity and success, with bands like Killswitch Engage and Bullet for My Valentine reaching high into the billboards. With Bullet for My Valentine, Scream Aim Fire reaching number 4 on its release. Nu metal's death also gave way to another genre, Gen, with its syncopated and polyrhythmic guitar instrumentation being attributed to Meshuggah's guitarist. It also gave birth to a genre almost as equally hated as nu metal, a fusion of death metal and metalcore. Deathcore was an amalgamation of blast beats, growls, and slammy breakdowns, which for some reason a lot of people didn't like. The genre was heralded by bands like Thy Art Is Murder and Suicide Silence. Despite the Nickelback treatment from the metal community, both bands were able to reach into the Billboard 200s. From the 2010 onwards, there haven't been huge shifts in the metal scene. There were interesting stories like Lamb of God's Randy Blythe and accidentally killing a 19-year-old by throwing him off stage in 2010 in the Czech Republic, or in 2014 with As I Lay Dying's frontman being arrested for attempting to hire an undercover hitman to kill his wife. So now we're at current day, from jazz blues to the Beatles, to Black Sabbath to Iron Maiden, hair, thrash, death, and so on. Even though there haven't been huge shifts in metal, the scene has continued to produce subgenres and sounds so vastly different from each other, it's hard to call it all metal. From Camelot to Archspire, what really is metal? Well, like all music, it's an expression. From religion to war, from heartbreak and depression, all the thematic elements and different instrumentation being so different, a good comparison would be the spectrum of color. If you haven't listened to metal before, I'm sure there's some combination of avant-garde, black doom synth pop, or Japanese metal reggae ska punk band that will interest you. And yes, that exists, and they're called Sim, and they're pretty good.